Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Brian Wrights, Executive Officer of the Durham Police Department. The Durham Police Department is releasing a synopsis of the internal investigation conducted by the Police Department's Professional Standards Division. This investigation is still ongoing, as there are parallel investigations being conducted by our Criminal Investigations Division and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. First of all, our thoughts and prayers continue to go out to the Huerta family during this difficult time. The department would like to acknowledge and commend the Durham community for support given to both the family of Jesus Huerta and the Durham Police Department. This synopsis today will provide answers to some questions concerning the events on November 19th. However, as this incident is still under investigation, all questions cannot be answered at this time. This briefing will proceed as follows. The synopsis to date will be presented by Professional Standards Division Commander Captain Laura Clayton. During Captain Clayton's presentation, there will be several items displayed on the screens behind us. After the report has been presented, Captain Clayton and Deputy Police Chief Anthony Marsh will answer questions as they pertain to the information presented. Any questions concerning the criminal investigation or other departmental matters cannot and will not be answered at this time. We ask that if you have a question, please wait for a microphone in order for your question to be captured for our recording of this briefing. At the conclusion of this briefing, a packet containing the synopsis to date and attachments will be provided by Candy Michael.
The following information is a synopsis of the administrative investigation of the death of Jesus Huerta up to this point. The focus of the administrative investigation is to address any violations of Durham Police Department policies and procedures. This investigation is independent of the investigation conducted by the State Bureau of Investigations. While the investigation itself is still ongoing, the information contained herein is based upon interviews of officers and any other persons directly involved in the incident, as well as evidence and facts obtained up to this point. The Durham Police Department is waiting for additional information, including the state medical examiner's final report and the toxicology report, in order to complete our final report. On Tuesday, November the 19th, 2013, Officer S. Duncan reported for duty at approximately 5:45 p.m. to begin a 12-hour night shift on uniform patrol. At the time of the incident, Officer Duncan had been with the department for 16 months and had just recently completed the final independent phase of his field training. After attending roll call briefing on this evening, Officer Duncan took control of car 225. As is standard protocol, upon taking control of a police vehicle, Officer Duncan inspected the vehicle to ensure that all emergency equipment was present and functioning properly. This inspection also included a search of the front seat and rear seat areas to ensure that no contraband of any kind had been left in the vehicle by the previous user. Car 225 had not been used during the 12-hour shift on that day. The most recent user prior to Officer Duncan was Officer Ortiz. Officer Ortiz advised that the only transport he did during his shift was providing a ride to a pregnant citizen. Officer Ortiz advised that he searched the passenger prior to allowing her to sit in the back seat, and he searched the back seat after she got out. No contraband was noted. At approximately 2:10 a.m. on the 19th, Durham Emergency Communications Center received a runaway juvenile call. This call was dispatched to Uniform Patrol a few minutes later. See Attachment 1, Computer-Aided Dispatch Report. The preliminary dispatch information is highlighted on page 7. The caller, Jesus Huerta's sister, advised the 911 dispatcher that her brother had attempted suicide in the past, but this information was not relayed in the CAD information sent to uniformed patrol officers via their mobile computer terminals in the police cars. The information from the information from the runaway call dispatch included the following information. Jesus Huerta, Hispanic male, 17 years old. He does not have any medical or mental conditions and is not at risk. Patrol Officer D. Pickle arrived at the caller's home on Washington Street and spoke to Silva Fernandez about her missing son, Jesus Huerta. One of Ms. Fernandez's sons translated for his mother since she spoke little English. Several other patrol officers, including Officer S. Duncan and Officer D. Beck, patrolled the immediate area looking for the missing teenager. At approximately 2:30 a.m., Officer Duncan and Officer Beck encountered two teenagers at Washington Street and Trinity Avenue. Although both teens originally provided false names, it was later determined that the teens were Jesus Huerta and Jaime Perez. The officers advised communications that they were out with the missing juvenile and another subject at Washington Street and Trinity Avenue. Patrol Sergeant V. Pearsall and Corporal M. Brown checked in with the officers. Sergeant Pearsall ran Jesus Huerta's name through a law enforcement database and determined there was an outstanding arrest warrant for trespassing on the runaway teenager. These same databases were used to help confirm the identity of Jaime Perez. Officer Duncan took Mr. Huerta into custody for the misdemeanor warrant and handcuffed him behind his back. Officer Duncan conducted a cursory search or frisk of Mr. Huerta's pant and jacket pockets and placed him in the back of his patrol car. Officer Duncan's frisk did not reveal any contraband. Officer Duncan advised that he searched Mr. Huerta by using his hands to sweep both sides of Mr. Huerta's body, including his waist area. Sergeant Pearsall observed Officer Duncan frisk Mr. Huerta's clothing, but did not see him search further. Corporal Brown was also present when Huerta was handcuffed by Officer Duncan. Corporal Brown advised that he observed Officer Duncan pat down or frisk Mr. Huerta. Jaime Perez, who was with Mr. Huerta during this encounter, advised that the officers only patted their pockets and looked in their coats. Mr. Huerta was wearing thin white leather baseball batting type gloves on both hands. See attachment 2 photo. Officer Duncan left the gloves on Mr. Huerta. Officer Duncan also took custody of a backpack Mr. Huerta was carrying and placed it in the trunk of his patrol car. Officer Beck initiated a conversation with Mr. Jaime Perez, who provided a false name of Carlos Lopez. Officer Beck went to the patrol car in which Mr. Huerta was seated in an effort to determine Mr. Perez's true identity. She observed that Mr. Huerta had moved his cuffed hands from behind his back to having them behind his knees. Officer Beck advised Officer Duncan about Mr. Huerta's actions. Officer Beck eventually determined Mr. Perez's real identity and arrested him for resist, delay, and obstruct a law enforcement officer. Officer Beck transported her arrestee to the Durham County Jail. As Officer Beck was leaving Washington Street, she observed Officer Duncan remove Mr. Huerta from the back seat of his patrol car. Officer Duncan directed Mr. Huerta to get out of the back seat of the car and told him to put his handcuffs back behind his back. Mr. Huerta initially tried to move his hands back from their position behind his knees, but advised that he would need to do it in a sitting position in the back of the patrol car. Officer Duncan let Mr. Huerta sit back in the car, where Mr. Huerta was able to return his cuffed hands behind his back. After placing Mr. Huerta back in the patrol car, Officer Duncan drove to Durham Police Headquarters to pick up the misdemeanor trespass warrant. The trip from Washington Street and Trinity Avenue to Durham Police Headquarters is approximately a mile and typically takes around 3 minutes travel time by car. Officer Duncan advised that per police protocol, he had inspected the back of his patrol car, car 225, for contraband at the beginning of his shift, and Mr. Huerta was the first person to be placed in the back seat during his shift. Officer Duncan did not store any of his own personal items or portable police equipment in the back seat either. Car 225 was not used during the 12-hour shift prior to Officer Duncan taking control of the car. As stated previously, Officer O. Ortiz, who used the car prior to Officer Duncan, advised that he had searched the patrol car back seat for contraband and it was clear when he parked the car. Officer Ortiz further advised that his only transport during his shift was to provide a ride to the pregnant citizen. However, he did search her prior to the transport, and he searched the car after the transport, and it was found to be clear. The patrol car seat is a fixed, one-piece hard plastic seat. There is a plexiglass and a metal containment cage between the rear passenger area and the front driver passenger area. The floorboard allows very little access to space under the front seats. See attachment 3, photo 1, photo 2, photo 3, photo 4, and photo 5, showing the back seat area of patrol car 225. Car 225 is equipped with an in-car video recording system. The in-car video camera for car 225 recorded video from the beginning of Officer Duncan's shift when he logged on at 6:05 p.m. until approximately 2:09 a.m. The camera system has an automatic shut-off feature that engages if the car is turned off for a certain amount of time to save the car battery. The camera will remain off unless the officer logs back on or activates his emergency lighting. It appears that the car was idle for more than 50 minutes, beginning at approximately 1:19 a.m. Once he restarted the car, Officer Duncan did not log back on to the camera system. Consequently, the camera was not recording during Mr. Huerta's arrest and transport. Officer Duncan advised that as he was driving to police headquarters, Mr. Huerta continued to move his cuffed hands so much that he had to tell Mr. Huerta several times to stop. Mr. Huerta responded by saying that he had a wedgie and was uncomfortable. Officer Duncan advised that he could also hear the sound of something rubbing against the hard plastic back seat area when Mr. Huerta was moving around, but he thought it was possibly the sound of the handcuffs rubbing against the seat. Officer Duncan advised that if he wasn't so close to headquarters, he would have pulled over to do a more extensive search of Mr. Huerta based on the arrestee's behavior in the back of the patrol car. Officer Duncan also advised that he planned on searching Mr. Huerta again once at police headquarters and felt that Mr. Huerta's behavior was indicative of someone trying to hide or discard drugs. Officer Duncan arrived at police headquarters with his arrestee, pulling into the main entrance from Chapel Hill Street. Soon after pulling into the entrance, Officer Duncan heard a loud noise that appeared to be a gunshot. The sound was very close and appeared to originate from inside the vehicle. Officer Duncan thought he was being shot at, so he jumped out of the vehicle while the vehicle transmission was still in drive. Duncan's patrol car continued moving forward until its front end collided with a parked van in the police parking lot. Officer Duncan also called out on the radio, "In the parking lot, shots fired." Officer J. Harris, who was also in the parking lot of police headquarters, observed Officer Duncan ducking down near the moving patrol car and then heard Duncan's radio traffic. Officer Harris went over to Officer Duncan, who told him that his prisoner was shooting at him. Both officers approached the wrecked patrol car with guns drawn and opened the rear seat door. Mr. Huerta was slumped over in the rear seat with his handcuffs behind his back. Blood was visible on the back seat, and a black semi-automatic .45 caliber pistol was lying on the right back seat floorboard. Officer Duncan called out over the police radio with the gunshot wound and requested emergency medical services. Mr. Huerta was declared deceased at the scene by EMS personnel. The State Bureau of Investigation was requested to investigate the in-custody death of Mr. Huerta. In addition, the Durham Police Department's Professional Standards Division, Forensic Staff, and Criminal Investigations Division are also involved in the investigation of the incident. Preliminary findings. Jesus Huerta had discussed committing suicide with some family members based upon information received during the 911 call. However, that information was not relayed to the patrol officers upon dispatch. Consequently, the officers believed they were dealing with a runaway teenager prior to discovery of the active warrant. A search warrant was later obtained for the information contained in Mr. Huerta's phone. A preliminary review of the data contained within his phone shows several text messages referring to guns. Review of this data is ongoing. Car 225 was inspected immediately prior to use by Officer Duncan, who found no contraband or weapons. Additionally, there is no reasonable place to conceal a handgun in the back seat area of car 225. Mr. Huerta was the first and only person transported in car 225 by Officer Duncan during his shift. Durham Police Forensics performed gunshot residue tests on Officer Duncan's hands and on the white batting gloves that Jesus Huerta was wearing when he was killed. The State Crime Lab processed the GSR test and reported that Officer Duncan's hands were negative for gunshot residue, and Jesus Huerta's gloves were positive for gunshot residue, indicating that Mr. Huerta fired a gun. See attachment 4, GSR report. The evidence and information collected thus far indicate that Mr. Huerta had a handgun concealed on his person. Officer Duncan did not discover the handgun during his search of Mr. Huerta. Mr. Huerta shot himself with that gun. All evidence indicates that Mr. Huerta died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms conducted a trace on the history of the handgun. The weapon is a Haskell .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun. The last known location of the gun was ABC Dependable Palm, located in Commerce, Georgia, on December 18, 1991. That pawn shop had been out of business and was identified by the ATF as not complying with the requirement to provide records of firearm transactions. No further information about the gun is available at this time. See attachment 5 photo. The Durham Police Department's Professional Standards Division is investigating possible violations of the following policies. General Order 4067, in custody death. General Order 4003, transporting and handling of prisoners. And General Order 4064, R3, mobile video cameras.
That concludes the presentation from Captain Clayton. I need to reiterate that any questions asked need to be limited to the information provided concerning the internal investigation, as this and other investigations are still ongoing. Please utilize this microphone when asking a question.
Were all procedures by Officer Duncan correct? All the procedures that he's supposed to be taking, were all of them correct?
We are still conducting an ongoing internal investigation. This is a synopsis of what has been done thus far, and the investigation is not concluded. So the determination on what the policies that we're looking at is forthcoming.
Has there been any conclusion about why the information about the suicide tendencies were not relayed from 911 to the officer?
We'll defer answering that question to Mr. Jim Sukup. He's the director of the Durham Emergency Communication Center.
When that question was asked, it was pretty much perceived by the 911 communication officer as something that had happened in the past. That's why a clarifying question was followed up on, and that was, are there any physical or mental conditions that the officer needs to be aware of? And that was answered in the negative, no. So that was the reason that that was recorded on the narrative.
Was Mr. Huerta's backpack searched at the time of his arrest?
Any questions regarding the backpack and its contents? All of that is pertinent to the ongoing criminal investigations. They're not really germane to the internal investigation into policy violations. So they're really not, they're outside the scope of this conversation at this moment.
Any reason why Chief Lopez is not here today? Why he's not talking?
As it pertains to this presentation, what this is an update from professional standards to the Chief of Police regarding an ongoing investigation. As such, he really would not have any additional information to provide to you. At the conclusion of this investigation, he will receive a final copy of the report through the officer's chain of command, consistent with all other administrative reviews.
Question back there.
Had that been known, that piece of information that he was suicidal, how would that have made it different? I mean, is there a policy of how the officer would have approached this differently had that been known by the officer?
Each and every citizen contact or runaway contact or victim contact is unique, and so in hindsight, I can't speak to how that encounter may have played out, may or may not have played out.
Could you just mention again what you're looking at in terms of, as part of the review, you said with, I think, Officer Duncan, in terms of what the transport, again, you had mentioned it toward the end, I just wanted to, again.
You speaking in terms of the specific policy, sir?
Yes.
We're looking at General Order 4067, in custody death. General Order 4003, transporting and handling of prisoners. And General Order 4064, R3, mobile video cameras.
We heard from the family's attorney. They, as you know, received a copy of this around noon today. And their question after reading this was why there wasn't some type of summary about what Perez said about whether or not Huerta had a gun at the time he was in the patrol.
You want that? Mr. Perez was interviewed by professional standards. He did provide, of course, a statement to the investigator. To the extent that there's still an ongoing investigation, we still have not come to any findings of facts or final determinations. It would be a little premature to speak to the context of that conversation. There are still things that need to be followed up on. So I really wouldn't want to go out and talk about that now. In the final report, of course, there will be information about that statement.
I have a couple questions, actually. When do you anticipate that final report will be available? Is there a timeline?
I am unable to give you a timeline for a couple of reasons. We're still awaiting, also, just like the SBI, we're awaiting the medical examiner's final report, a final forensic report. While the SBI has provided some information to the district attorney, they have not provided an actual quote-unquote final report. Certainly we would like a final opinion from the district attorney as well. And also, this is still an ongoing investigation, so there may or may not be additional follow-up steps for the professional standards investigator to pursue. So honestly, I just can't give you a specific timeline. Investigation, this is not a quick process. Investigations are, by their very nature, sometimes slow. No two are alike. And the important thing for the public is to receive the truth. And it takes time to get to the truth. An investigation should proceed in a methodical and deliberate manner, and we certainly wouldn't want to put accuracy at risk for the sake of rushing to satisfy a desire to know. You got a follow-up question?
Yeah, a couple, actually. I didn't hear you mention a ballistics report earlier. Was there a round recovered, and if so, did it link back to that gun?
Very good question. The gun and any other ballistic evidence has already been submitted for IBIS testing. We do not have those results back as of yet.
And because you didn't mention it, we can assume, other than knowing that the gun was last in Georgia in 1991, y'all have not been able, through your investigation, to determine how Mr. Huerta might have gotten that gun, or where that gun came from, or who had the gun prior to him. Y'all have no indication where the gun came from or how he got it.
No, sir. The last documentation stops in Georgia at 1991.
But through your course of your investigation, you've not been able to find any witnesses that put him with that gun.
That would be speaking to Mr. Perez's statement, which I've already said we can't speak to quite yet. That will be in the
There were
final
other
report.
witnesses other than Mr. Perez, but you're saying, are there, I understand what you're saying about Mr. Perez, but are there other witnesses that y'all have been able to talk to? Have any of those witnesses provided any information about Mr. Huerta having that gun, or selling him that gun, or where that gun might have come from?
No, sir.
And as far as this media conference, why not have it in a larger place where we're kind of squeezed in here, as you can tell, where maybe members of the public could come and hear the same information for themselves and have an opportunity to ask questions?
That option is certainly available to us. This was more of a media briefing to provide this information. The second reason is we wanted to be able to record it. Third, we have access to our audio-visual equipment to place the displays up on the screen for everyone else to see. Since we can record it, if we choose to, we can actually put it on our Facebook page, we can put it on a website, we can put it on Cable 8, so the general public will actually have access to this same information.
But presumably the council chambers would have had all of that available as well, correct?
They do have AV equipment, it's not ours.
The search that Officer Duncan performed, was that up to specs? Is that procedure? I guess one question that I still have and others may have is, how did he miss that gun?
Speaking to any sort of rewind, for me to say that the search was appropriate or inappropriate or within policy or out of policy, that would be rendering a finding of fact for an investigation that's still ongoing, and it would be premature for us to do that at this point. What we can say is he searched Mr. Huerta. What we can say is he missed the gun. That's as far as I can go at this point.
Can you recall in Durham PD's history or your familiarity with that, anybody ever missing a gun like this? Has it ever happened before?
I wouldn't want to put the department's reputation on my memory alone. We've got over 500 officers here. I've been here since 1995, so I certainly couldn't speak to what happened prior to 1995. I can say that this happens throughout our profession. It's not just Durham PD. There are times when items are missed. In many cases, it goes towards the detriment of the officer. Officer winds up injured. But to that extent, it does happen across the profession, and certainly this would be a wake-up call, as any other tragedies are to our profession.
About the gun, I couldn't read the ruler at the bottom of the picture there of the gun. How big is that weapon?
Off the top of my head, sir, I could honestly not tell you. However, when you pick up the packet, there'll be a photo of it in there, and it has the scale on there. But I honestly don't know.
That looks like a millimeter scale or centimeter scale.
You'd have to talk to our forensic people.
Okay.
But it's a full frame weapon. It's a full size 45.
Since I have not seen it personally, I wouldn't want to speak to it.
Does the investigator have? Is it a full frame 45?
I have not seen it either, other than the pictures that were turned over.
Just one point of clarification.
Yes, sir.
One shot, one gunshot, one bullet.
Yes, sir.
And when I asked about the ballistics, y'all have recovered a bullet. You did send a bullet with.
Without the actual forensic report, I wouldn't want to speculate and say yay or nay. I think they did, but you might want to wait until we get your final forensic report before I say that.
Does the investigator know?
I do not know the answer to that at this point.
So
So the primary investigator of this case doesn't know whether a bullet was recovered?
She's the captain of professional standards. She's not the lead investigator,
I
sir.
understand, but
And the investigative file is actually fairly thick thus far, and we're not even finished. So there's quite a bit of evidence, there's quite a bit of documentation.
a pretty elemental.
But it will be in the final forensic report.
Question. The officer status right now with the department?
He is on administrative duty. He is doing office work. He is not functioning as a sworn law enforcement officer, and I cannot give you a timeline as to how long that will be.
Wanted to confirm the gunshot wound was to the head, correct?
It was a gunshot wound to the head.
Have y'all been able to figure out how someone could shoot themselves in the head with their handcuffs tied behind their back?
Well, actually, I'm glad you asked that. As I'm sure that many of you are aware, not only can it be done, it has been done in other jurisdictions. To that point, we have one or two, just a couple. What you're looking at are stills from a video from Jonesboro, Arkansas in 2012, and they just sort of did a demo to demonstrate the flexibility of someone in handcuffs. This is not evidentiary in nature. It does not illustrate this is what happened in this case. It is purely to illustrate the possibility that someone with that degree of flexibility and that degree of motivation could conceivably access a concealed handgun and use it to harm themselves either intentionally or unintentionally while wearing handcuffs. Last one.
Question, sir.
You did confirm it was a gunshot wound to the head. Can you tell us roughly where on the head? Forehead, back of head, front of head?
I wouldn't want to speak to that until we get the final medical examiner's report.
But presumably that is information y'all have. Is there any reason that information's not available other than y'all just haven't gotten the final report?
You're talking about specifics of where on the head.
Yeah.
That would come from the ME. We don't do
But y'all
autopsy.
received a preliminary report from the ME that
We received what's called a death certificate, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't know that it goes into that degree of specificity in terms of trajectory, entry, exit, et cetera, You really should wait for the final medical examiner's report on that, as we are as well.
Has it been determined that he did have that kind of flexibility? You said somebody with that type of flexibility.
Right.
I mean, how can you determine that, and has that been determined?
Well, the fact that it occurred is suggestive. I can't say that anyone has gone back to inquire with his family to see what he could or could not do physically. At this point, all the evidence suggests very strongly and indicates that he basically died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in the back of that police car.
Thank you very much.